I'm just going to be thoroughly honest. It's been a really hard week. Watching your interim search process unfold has been a bit heartbreaking. So much rides on you getting the right minister, and really kind of at the right time. I spent a lot of time just looking out the minister's office window, not the broken one that we repaired, staring at those newly leafing out trees and saying, we all have to get you a minister. So needless to say, having my head wrapped up in the minister's search all week led to some pretty poor sermon writing. I'll just own it. So we're going to keep the expectations for Margo's sermon rather low today, although I think you will get something out of it. But mostly, I think it's just good to be together this morning. The sermon today is about pluralism, and I've been thinking about this sermon for weeks. And at first I was going to talk a bit about political pluralism, racial pluralism, cultural pluralism, which are all important. And after that, segue into Walt Whitman's comment that we all contain multitudes within. But given the news about the search process, I'm scrapping political, racial, and cultural pluralism for the day. We'll come back to it. Because I think we're going to need to think about the multitudes within. And I mean within, right here. Because I want us to feel resourced. I also want to say I've been in tears over this week, more than once. And that's a surprise to me because it's your congregation, but I just feel such an investment in how you continue on from year 60, 65, into year 66, into year 67. And it frustrated me that people did not see your glory and your beauty. I actually think they do see your glory and your beauty, but they have lives too, right? So, all right. So the following is a little bit about my story because I'm also in the process of thinking about leaving. It's a big time of change for me. But my story is the surface story. It's just the upper crust. So down below is the congregational story. It's everybody's story. And it's how we become great multitudes. I'm not sure how many of you remember my first sermon here. And many of you are newer. So you may not even been in the building to hear that first sermon on August 7th of 2022. And I literally can pull that date from my head for some reason. It was about the nostalgia of your past ministers and what you learned from them, and the extremely good fortune that I know one of your past ministers. She was one of my mentors, Lois Van Leer. It was also about how my family was called to Bozeman across 3 different generations. My father was called to Bozeman at the age of 12. Before that, his aunt was called to Bozeman for love. She married Bert Powell. And finally, I was called to Bozeman. Well, my father had a destination of his aunt and uncle who were already living here, as it turns out by a little beyond Four Corners. I was coming to all of you in a completely different city. The landscape had changed entirely. You were a congregation unknown to me, except for a really pretty sparse contact during the interim search process, because you cannot believe how weird and abbreviated and it's just that process is. It's intense and it's, what's the word I want? Shout it out. It's just odd. But I stayed in the process of coming here in 2022. I reflected a lot on my father's story during that time because I was feeling stirred up and I was feeling worried. Like, what if we weren't a good match when I got here? And what if Bozeman was not as beautiful? And amazing as I thought, but it was. And so were you. And as it relates to pluralism, how his life experiences took him from being 12 into this multifaceted personality. He had a survival persona. He also became extremely resourceful, courageous, brave, unstoppable, despite some pretty big setbacks. And he was always forward-looking, despite big setbacks. And he didn't choose to live just anywhere. He was craving something. He was craving a family. He was craving stability. And he craved a bigger community, although he didn't know that at the time. My father grew up in North Carolina, in Appalachia, in poor, poor places, at a farm and later in a logging camp. His parents were alcoholic, abusive, and neglectful in ways that led to child abuse of his sisters. There wasn't enough money to buy groceries sometimes. They skipped meals entirely. The home was full of violence. And at the age of 12, my father decided he was leaving. He had a 6th grade education, so where was he going to go? He knew he had an aunt who married for love and went to Bozeman. And he knew Bozeman was far from Appalachia. Far away was where he wanted to be. And he knew people created things out west. An uncle had gone to Washington State and was working in the logging industry there. My father jumped on a moving freight train, moving slowly. He does not exaggerate that story, moving slowly like molasses, but it was moving. And he jumped on the freight train. He rode through several towns until he came to a city large enough where he thought they might need workers. He did find a job at the age of 12 in a furniture-making business. He wrote to his aunt and uncle in Bozeman and said, "Can I come live with you and work on the horse ranch?" And they wrote back and said, "Come." But they sent no money for his travel. Setback. So he jumped on another moving freight train. This one, he'll tell you, was moving a little faster, and he rode in a boxcar. But he'd had a little bit of money in his pocket, so he had bought some snacks and a little rucksack, and he had an extra shirt. And eventually, trains became freedom for my father, and those railroad workers became his community. And some of those railroad workers looked the other way because they could see how young he was. So he arrived in Bozeman and went to live with his aunt and uncle. Aunt by blood, uncle by marriage. So look at how these multitudes are starting to grow. Traveler, risk taker, family seeker, resource maker. It kind of sounds like all of you. Resource makers, family, visionaries. So family lore says that Aunt Lily and Uncle Bert owned a horse ranch out beyond Four Corners. However, do you know how often these family stories are not quite? Yeah. So I've been sleuthing as of late. I was able to get census records from 1930, 1940, and 1950. And in the 30s and 40s, they say he was laboring on someone else's ranch. And now I vaguely know where that was. And by the 1950s, Aunt Lily and Uncle Bert had moved into town. And as it turns out, it was actually before then. And to my delight, I can tell you they lived at North Bozeman Street and 4th. And if you start thinking about that neighborhood, it is right across the street from the BL Community Center. So that beautiful stone community center. And I checked out the dates. It would have been built by the time he was living there. But I digress. So at the age of 18, my father started on the Milwaukee Road Railroad. This time legally riding the rails from Bozeman to the Seattle area. It was actually Tacoma and Everett, and back again, and to some other places in Montana, and occasionally a little further east. Adding this community to his personality, his pluralism within him now included his railroad family. He continued to add on multitudes. His work ethic, his expanding sense of adventure, a feeling of competence, reliability. People on the railroad depend on one another for their very lives. Railroad work was extremely dangerous back then. I mean, it still is, but extremely dangerous back then, and very few safety standards. My father was starting to fill in this craving for a community. He'd found his biological family. He connected with a few relatives that had moved to Washington State. Eventually, his oldest brother moved there. So the realization that was starting to happen is that he actually deserved caring and dependability. He was discovering his inherent worthiness. As I hope all of you have a really solid sense of, even though a minister has not been found, that you retain at the bedrock of your being that sense of worthiness as people and as a congregation. Because my time with you is coming to an end, I am just getting more nostalgic by the day. And let me just say, it's also been somewhat amazing to me that in less than 2 years, I have filled that many memories. Somebody asked me the other day, what am I going to miss? And I'm like, how long have you got? Because it's a really long list. I pulled out that first sermon that I preached from the pulpit because I liked the idea of having some bookends on it. I crafted that so tenderly for all of you about how a relationship starts. And part of it is that the preparation of the heart. And I talked about being on the Hiawatha bike route on the Montana-Idaho border. How many of you know anything about that bike route? Okay. You don't need to. But I want to read you a short little piece from that sermon because I feel like it's where we are today in the search process. I am talking about being in a 1.6-mile tunnel that's no longer, the railroad tracks have been removed. It happened to be a Milwaukee Railroad tunnel. I would have ridden it anyway. It was a destination for me, but I can't even describe how wonderful that was. So what I said, and what you have to understand about the tunnel is if you turn off your bike light, the tunnel is pitch black. You can't see anything inside. So imagine being in that for 1.6 miles, on a bicycle, no less. Even with the bike light on my helmet, the darkness is so vast that the light provides very little context. The rumors were true. You can only see about 8 feet ahead, and even with that, not very well. The rest is lost in the darkness. And because of that, there's no sense of forward motion, even though you are consistently pedaling. Some people get so disoriented that they have to get off their bikes and walk the rest of the way out the tunnel, let me say, and that is a perfectly okay thing to do. You can't see the water that is running down the sides of the tunnel. It's thick and it's steady. And it goes into these huge grates on both sides that you can't see. Hearing is distorted. Simultaneously, it's magnified by the echo in the tunnel. So if I'm yelling at my friend who's riding a little ahead of me, it's magnified by the echo, but it is instantly silenced by the white noise of all this running water. You can't even hear the squeaky pedals of the person behind you. Well, who had started out behind me. I didn't even know if they were still back there. And in this tunnel, it feels like time stands still. And to depending on where you are in your own process, this could all feel rather wonderful. You can be curious about it, but you're probably going to feel some anxiety. And because that packed pebble route was very, very wet, it was like wading through chocolate pudding. And then there was all this smell of coal and minerals. I really wondered, what did the top of this tunnel look like with all that coal smoke that had been up there in decades prior? My brain literally could not make sense of any of the experience. I just wanted, at one point, I wanted to ride more quickly. I wanted it over, and it started to not feel safe. I was anxious. I knew I was anxious. And then I remembered, wait a minute. This is a Milwaukee Road tunnel. In some ways, a part of me has been here before, only through family story. I called out to my dad, who'd been dead for decades, and I said, Dad, okay, he'd been dead for decades, but I swear, just right on the handlebars of the bike, right on the handlebars of the bike. And I said, let me trust the process. I know you've been through so many railroad tunnels, Dad. Tell me my bike is steady and my legs are strong. And he did. So at first I thought it was weird that I was just running around with this story in my head all week. I'm like, what do I do with this story? It wasn't going to be the sermon when I started. But then I realized that's kind of where you are, you UFB. You are in the long tunnel. There's light at the end. You can actually see the little bit of light at the end. And let me just say, thousands of people have made it through that tunnel. So you can experience some confidence about this. It's okay to get off your bike for a while and just walk. Find your own pace. But you can't use your senses quite the way you normally would. Not your senses, not your intellect. And even your hope starts to feel a little different. And that can make you feel anxious. But what would it be like to be curious? And what would it like to feel some confidence? We've done this before. So I'm thinking about the pluralism. And I want all of you to come up with a word or a short phrase that describes your multitudes out there. And I'm going to give you an example. I think about it as great leadership is one of the things you have. I think about the committees, I think about the board. Your own building. Yeah, yell them out popcorn style. You have a building, a home. Dedication. Community. Hard workers. Persistence. Commitment. Resourceful. I didn't hear that one. Visions. Yeah. Joy. Say it again. Service. Yes. What else have I seen? Curiosity. Stability, uplifting, gratitude, patience. Yes, that will serve you really well. And connections, right? Out there in the bigger community. Fela, we have Fela. That one is love of our kids, right? Fela grew up in this fellowship. Neil's got one. Love. Yeah. I think you're going to be all right. It's going to take longer than you want to get a minister. You know you've done this before. It's more complicated now. because there's more going on and you have staff, but you've got the basic things to do this. So there you are. You are multitudes. And then I could stop crying at my desk. With all of that talent and courage and care, I just became confident. Well, I was always confident, but I was always confident, but I could start to just really feel it in my bones. And the anxiety went away. So the next year might feel strange. Well, it's already felt strange. Come on, the search process, the inner search, it's already been weird. It's already been a bit disorienting. But you're all in it together. And I'm going to end there. Oh, I was long-winded. And say, blessed be.